Good morning, everyone. My name is Leslie Dock. I'm the chair of Protect Our Care, and thanks for joining us today. We called this event together because over the weekend, we've learned some very unsettling and news about what is happening and potentially happening in Congress as it relates to giving Medicare the power to negotiate for lower drug prices for Americans. Pharma and its supporters in Congress have unearthed a new proposal that would basically gut the Medicare negotiation promise. They basically have said that they want to limit negotiations. Let me put it the other way. What they're saying is that there should be no negotiations for any bill that is covered by a patent and has no competition. So what they're saying is that that the bills that need negotiation the most, the ones that are the most expensive, would be off the table. And this would leave Americans continuing to pay 3 times more than people do in other countries for the most important drugs they rely on to save their lives. And it would mean that they would continue to have to choose between paying for drugs they need and putting food on the table or a roof amongst their heads. This is just completely unacceptable to the American people. And anyone who would then claim that a bill with this provision, with these restrictions, would include real negotiations, would basically be not telling the truth to the American people. I'll have a few more comments as we go on, but I want to introduce our speakers, and so we can begin the rest of the program. Our initial speaker is Congressman Peter Welch from Vermont, who, I think everybody on this call knows, has been a leader on this issue. He's been a fighter to reduce drug prices and has been a leader on the Energy Commerce Committee in the House to stand up to big pharma. Our next speaker after that will be Jeff Guerin, the president of Heart Research. Jeff is the foremost Democratic pollster when it comes to issues surrounding health and healthcare, and has really laid the groundwork for the public discussion and political discussion of these issues. David Mitchell is the president and head of Patients for Affordable Drugs, which is the most effective voice for patients in this debate. And David himself is a patient, unfortunately, a patient with an incurable but treatable blood cancer. And he is intimately and personally familiar with the cost of these drugs. And then our final speaker will be Richard Frank, who is the director of the USC Brookings Schaefer Initiative on Health Policy, who is one of the foremost experts in America in health economics and on the cost of drugs. So with that, let me turn it over to Representative Welch to kick us off.
Thank you very much. Just one correction in your introduction. I don't consider myself somebody who's standing up to big pharma. Pharma is an issue, but what I want to think of is I'm standing up for taxpayers, I'm standing up for patients and consumers, and I'm standing up for employers who are getting hammered with these brutal premium increases significantly attributable to the runaway cost of pharmaceutical drugs. And this government, the United States government, is literally the only Western democracy. It's the only Western democracy where the government does not do anything to protect its citizens against price gouging. And this whole HR 3 is about changing that and bringing us into, in effect, the modern world when it comes to having fair prescription drug pricing. There's a couple of points. I mean, we all know how much more expensive it is here than elsewhere. And the pharma argument is that if there's any type of negotiation, it's going to result in the loss of innovation. That's really untrue. And the best example of that is COVID. The United States government taxpayer put an immense amount of money into research, put an immense amount of money into advance expenditures on production, taking the risk entirely away from the pharmaceutical industry. And it guaranteed, of course, a market. And it turns out that there was a negotiated price there, $19.50 per dose with Pfizer. And at the end of the day, Pfizer made about $30 billion on that last year. So you had an example of price negotiation where there really was a public-private partnership. And that's what can and should happen with other medications that are coming online, or we hope to have come online to alleviate pain and extend life. The other point that's really important for all of us to, I think, understand is that there's no industry in America, literally no industry in America, that enjoys as much governmental support as the pharmaceutical industry. They get taxpayer financed research. They get the benefit of exclusivity during a period of time when they're allowed to set the price as a monopoly. They get patent protection in the court system, which unfortunately has been extending patents beyond the original life. And they get a guaranteed market that is set up essentially as a result of taxpayer and public policy commitment to Medicare, to Medicaid, and of course, employer-sponsored healthcare. So you have an industry that gets taxpayer support for research, gets governmental protection, giving it monopoly pricing power, and the government sets up the market. Pharma doesn't even have to do that. So no other industry enjoys that amount of special privilege as does the pharmaceutical industry. What does pharmaceutical industry do? It abuses that power. No industry has imposed such profiteering expenses on consumers and on taxpayers as the pharmaceutical industry. And it's got to end. And the reason it's got to end is it's not sustainable. You just can't have employers suffering these huge premium spikes when they're doing their best to provide their employees with access to health care. And of course, our taxpayers on Medicare and Medicaid, who are taxpayers who are supporting all of us, Medicare and Medicaid, need some relief so that healthcare can be affordable. Price negotiation is a practical, common sense way where instead of government being the sucker, where we buy wholesale and pay retail, we do what every other purchaser does. We negotiate bulk price discounts. And in fact, every other entity in government does that. I mean, even the Defense Department gets to negotiate with its sources to try to get a better deal for the taxpayer. So it's really, really essential that we do that because it's just squandering money that doesn't have any benefit to taxpayers and is an incredible burden on our taxpayers and on our employers. And of course, the source of enormous anxiety for families whose loved one is in need of prescription drugs that are out of reach. And it's everything from the cancer drugs that David Mitchell will talk about to something as old as insulin that's been around forever, but because of the pricing power of pharma, a lot of folks in Vermont pre-COVID had to go to Canada to try to get affordable doses. So it's outrageous and it's unjustifiable. And the other point here is that by saving money, simply by stopping the ripoff, we have options to do things that are good for folks that voted for Trump or voted for Biden. We can broaden Medicare benefits, possibly to hearing, vision, and dental, or we can extend Medicaid to folks in states that don't have it. Very popular. And of course, we can lower premiums on the Affordable Care Act. So it's totally, completely, utterly irresponsible for us not to do it. Pharma is powerful. There's immense support in the House and in the Senate, but it's not unanimous. We've got a tight margin, as you know, 50-50 in the Senate, a couple of votes in the House. But the overwhelming number of Democrats support this. And of course, on the Republican side, Mitch McConnell's fight for failure, there's no support there, even among folks who, when Trump was president and promoting this, supported it. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Leslie.
Hey, Leslie, if you're talking, you're unmuted. You're on mute.
Apologize. Thank you, Congressman Welch. The House of Representatives, under Congressman Welch's leadership and that of his colleagues, recently passed a Build Back Better bill that would have saved consumers and the taxpayer hundreds of billions of dollars in drug costs. The linchpin of that was giving Medicare the power to negotiate for lower drug prices, as Representative Welch has mentioned. That is the key that unlocks the door to cheaper prices. Now that bill has moved to the Senate, and the Senate holds the fate of negotiated prices in their hands. Knowing how important negotiations are, and as Jeff's going to explain in a second, how immensely popular they are, what is happening now, and what is happening over this last weekend, is that the pro-pharma members of the Senate are trying to push through sham negotiations that will fail to deliver on a promise to the American people to lower drug prices. Sham negotiations that will mean that those most expensive drugs over which the pharmaceutical industry has monopoly pricing rights will not be subject to negotiation. Those profits, that ripoff will be protected. And that's what our subject particularly is today, to call out that truth and to demand that robust negotiations be part of the final bill. And let me now turn it over to Jeff to talk through about what the American people want and need out of this bill. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Leslie. We have been polling on prescription drug costs for several years. We finished a survey for Protect Our Care on the Build Back Better Act last month. And there are 4 points that are important to understand as we head into the final days of this debate. First is that support for giving Medicare the power to negotiate with drug companies for lower prices is nearly universal in the country, and it crosses party lines. That the support for Medicare price negotiations is durable, by which I mean it stands up to the kinds of attacks that pharma and its allies level against it. That lowering the cost of prescription drugs and establishing a system of negotiation to lower prices is a priority for voters, both in and of itself and within the various topics that may be addressed in the Build Back Better Act. And finally, just from a purely political standpoint, that failing to include robust price negotiations in the final bill is a huge opportunity cost for Democrats. The midterm elections are going to be difficult and challenging. The support for Medicare price negotiations is substantial, and having that passing Medicare negotiations would be the kind of accomplishment that will, I think, justify voters supporting Democrats for re-election, and that establishes a compelling contrast with Republicans who oppose Medicare price negotiations. On the question of the importance of all of this, we asked voters about how important various topics are for the president and Congress to address. On the question of lowering the price of prescription drugs and stopping excessive drug price increases by giving Medicare the power to negotiate with drug companies for lower prices, 86% of voters say that that is very or fairly important to them. 6 out of 10 voters say it is very important. So give the top box response to that. Part of the reason why it is so important to voters is that there's an overwhelming consensus in the country today that the amount that pharmaceutical companies charge for prescription drugs is unreasonable. 75% say what the pharma companies charge is unreasonable, including 38% who say it's very unreasonable. And this is a view that crosses party lines. Uh, in fact, Republicans at 77% are a little bit more likely than Democrats at 71% to say that what pharma companies charge is unreasonable today. And when people think about what Congress may do or not do, the fear in the country among voters is not that Congress is going to go too far in regulating the price of prescription drugs, but that it won't go far enough to lower the cost of prescription drugs. When we ask people that question directly, 61% say they worry more that Congress is not going to go far enough to lower prescription drug costs, while only 28% say they worry that Congress is going to go too far in regulating the price of that pharmaceutical companies can charge. Again, this is a bipartisan view, even when we're invoking the notion of regulation, something that most Republicans don't like. By 51 to 38, Republican voters say that they're more concerned that Congress is not going to go far enough to lower the cost of prescription drugs than that it's going to go too far in regulating prescription drug costs. As part of this poll, we listed out 12 different topics that may be covered in the Build Back Better Act and asked voters to prioritize those, to tell us which is their top 3 most important of the 12 or top 5 most important. Consistently across subgroups of the electorate, reducing the cost of prescription drugs by giving Medicare the power to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies for lower prices is the top rated priority, the most frequently selected priority for voters. And again, this crosses party lines. And so that when people think of what they want out of this bill, having a robust system to lower prescription drug costs is at the very top of the list of those priorities. And when I mentioned that support for this provision is nearly universal, we asked people about the idea of reducing the cost of prescription drugs by giving Medicare the power to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies for lower prices. 94% of voters say that this is something they support. 60% of voters strongly support it. So, you know, you rarely get numbers at that level of magnitude. And this has been a clear and consistent finding over a number of years. And when I say that it's durable, let me give you an example of that. We tested this support against the criticism by opponents. We don't identify it with pharma. We just say that opponents say that by establishing government price controls, so we use that word on prescription drugs, this legislation will reduce the ability of pharmaceutical companies to invest in the discovery of new life-saving medicines to treat cancer, Alzheimer's, and other diseases. Against that, we say on the other side that millions of Americans can't afford their medications. While drug companies make huge profits, Americans should not have to choose between paying for the medicines they need or paying for the food and rent, and should not have to pay 3 times more for medicines than other people in other countries. So when we give their argument against the argument in support of Medicare price negotiations, people come down by 67 to 33 on the side of Medicare price negotiations. So even in the face of the strongest argument by the other side, voters continue to support Medicare price negotiations. And then the final point I'll make in terms of opportunity costs is that we've looked at a situation, a scenario where the Democratic candidate supports Medicare price negotiations, the Republican opposes them. This is an issue that expands support for the Democrat over what the natural baseline would be by a significant amount, and there's real intensity there. And the opportunity cost is that in terms of being able to speak to an accomplishment that really matters, that justifies having Democrats be in the majority, it is that what Democrats will be losing out on is the ability to say things like giving Medicare the power to negotiate lower drug prices for all Americans will save patients $158 billion over the next 7 years and will lower the cost of some drugs by as much as 55%. Not being able to say that in the campaign commercials and the campaign activities next year is going to be a huge political sacrifice for Democrats in an election where they're going to need to be able to bring their strongest arguments to bear. So from a public opinion standpoint and from a political calculus standpoint, that really having the most robust possible version of Medicare price negotiation is really very much of an open and shut case in its favor. So Leslie, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Jeff's made it completely clear how important these provisions are to the American public, how important it is that they see their drug prices go down, that it's the single most popular provision in the Build Back Better Act. And the key to that is giving Medicare the power to negotiate for lower drug prices. It is an arcane, one could say, policy set of words, but they are words that the American public understand to have incredible power. So the key to delivering on the promise that to the American public to do something about it is to have strong Medicare negotiations in the final bill. To accept this suggestion from pharma is not a compromise, it's a capitulation. And with that, let me now turn it over to David Mitchell.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks to Congressman Welch for your leadership. In the next few days, the days ahead are going to be very critical in the fight for reforms that will actually lower prices of brand name drugs for patients and for every American. I'm one of those patients. As Leslie mentioned, I have an incurable blood cancer. It's called multiple myeloma. And prescription drugs are keeping me alive, literally. It's the same cancer folks have heard a lot about recently that Colin Powell had. Right now, my doctors have me on a 4-drug combination, including all the major classes of myeloma drugs, with a list price of $900,000 a year. Just one of my oral drugs, called Pomalyst, will cost me more than $15,000 out of pocket this year through Medicare Part D. Having said that, I'm a very lucky man. These drugs are keeping my cancer at bay. But eventually, this combination will stop working, and I'll need a new treatment and one after that. Or I'll die sooner than I hope to, and that's not theoretical, it's just an unfortunate fact. So I care deeply about innovation and new drug development. But drugs don't work if people can't afford them. Patients know this. They're victims of a system that forces US citizens to pay at least 3 times what people in other nations pay for the same brand name drugs. A system in which their government cannot negotiate a better deal on their behalf. Now, drug companies and their allies in Congress prey on the fears of patients like me when they oppose any steps to curb their unilateral power to dictate prices. They say patients have to choose innovation or affordability, but it's a false choice. The truth is, we can restore balance to ensure we get the innovation we need at prices we can afford. Biopharma profit margins are almost 3 times the average of the S&P 500. A study showed industry could absorb reduced revenue up to $1 trillion over 10 years, maintain current R&D spending levels, and still be the nation's most profitable industry. CBO says if we reduce pharma revenue as proposed in the most ambitious bill in Congress, we'll see less than a 7% decline in new drugs coming to market. 2 fewer drugs per year on average out of a total of 900 over 30 years. But remember, only 10 to 15% of new drugs actually represent true therapeutic advancement. So we're trading a tiny impact on drug development in order to make existing drugs affordable now and in the future. Done right, negotiations will actually drive innovation. How? Well, if drug companies continue to have the power to raise prices on their current drugs at will, to hit profit targets and trigger executive bonuses, they have far less incentive to take risk and invest in R&D to find innovative new drugs that could command high prices and save lives. By creating a negotiating framework that rewards value and making clear that we'll pay the best prices for the best drugs, we will actually stimulate innovation. Second, the engine of the greatest innovation is the federal government. So by funding ARPA-H, the president's proposal for a new research entity, increasing spending for NIH, we can increase innovation to more than compensate for the tiny loss that CBO identifies and that pharma describes like it's Armageddon for the industry. Today, we're closer than we've been in almost 2 decades to achieving these reforms. Reforms to fix what pharma bought and paid for in 2003. We can repeal the non-interference clause and let Medicare negotiate. It's within reach. The key now, as Leslie has pointed out, is to hold the line on the last minute push by pharma and its handmaidens in Congress who are trying to find ways to gut the bill and to gut the provisions of Medicare negotiation in Build Back Better. That's the whole intent of the Peter Schrader bill. For example, by exempting drugs from negotiations with patent or exclusivity through the FDA, that bill will maintain the status quo. In some ways, it will make it even worse. Under that bill, drug corporations will still be able to dictate the prices of brand drugs for up to 21 years after coming to market. Read the bill. Let's be clear. Medicare must be able to negotiate over any and all high-cost drugs that have little or no competition in both parts B and D, period. And we need a workable mechanism to ensure they'll come to the table and bargain. It's a critical week. Pharma will do anything to maintain its power to dictate prices of brand drugs to the American people. But champions in Congress and in the White House are standing strong for patients. When the dust clears, I think we're going to win reforms to ensure patients can, in fact, get the innovative drugs they need at prices they can afford. Leslie?
Thanks, David. Let me now turn it over to Richard Frank.
Thank you, Leslie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I am just going to make 2 sets of points very briefly. The first is what is the focal point of negotiation? I think it's important to emphasize that negotiation is really targeted to where the markets fail. In some parts of the industry, market works pretty well, but there are some very big portions of it where the market fails. And this can be seen clearly from just looking at the groups of candidates that are the focus of these legislative proposals. And in particular, I want you to think about those sets of drugs that have extended their monopoly provisions way beyond what's reasonable. So let me just give you some numbers here. If you look at Medicare Part B, and you look at the top 25 drugs, which sort of aligns with many of the proposals out there, there is about $23 billion in spending in those drugs. It's 63% of the total spent on Part B on drugs. And of that group, the average length of time on the market, not just time on patent, but time on the market is 14 years, okay? This is a very long period, and it's because patent games have allowed these drugs to go way beyond the intent of the original patent thing. Let's turn to Part D. Part D, and I'm talking now about net prices. If you look at the top 25 drugs, we're talking about $33 billion in spending, which is about 27% of the total Part D spending, and these are net dollars. And the median duration of time on the market is about 10 years. And so what you have is half the drugs in both of these categories that account for 63% in one case and 27% of spending in the other case are drugs that have been on the market a tremendously long time that have reaped very large profits. Let me give you a couple of examples. Revlimid which is a Part D drug, has been on the market for over 15 years. And in 2019, it had revenues of $4.67 billion, and these are net revenues. And so you can, and on an equivalent one on the Part D side is if you look at the drug Rituxan, which is the number one seller, one of the number one sellers. It's been on the market for 23.3 years, and it in 2019 had sales of $1.7 billion. So these are just classic examples of market failures, and really these are the targets of innovation. And these drugs have been on the market for long enough to more than recoup their cost of R&D and those of many failed exercises for those firms. The second point I want to make has to do with the claims about innovation, which David mentioned, highlighted the fact that they're exaggerated. And I want to sort of add some color to that point. Drugs that come onto the market when it grows are typically late entrants. That is, the evidence that pharma and others are using to make claims about, and including CBO, that are make claims and to assess what would happen if we reduced revenues in those markets, well, they don't highlight the fact that those drugs are typically late entrants into each therapeutic class. That is, they come into crowded classes where there's a lot of treatment already available, and in fact, generally don't represent new science. In fact, there's a term that these new entrants tend to be off-the-shelf products, ones where the science is well developed and where when the market grows, suddenly they become more profitable and then they come on to the market. But again, they add relatively little in a therapeutic sense to the arsenal that's already there. The second point is that the evidence suggests that that patents and new science, as measured by new articles in major scientific journals, they're not driven by market expansions. If you look at the data on the rate at which patents are advanced and the rate at which new publications for scientific breakthroughs come out, there isn't very much relationship between that and market expansions. So again, this sort of strengthens the point that the scaling back of the types we're talking about here will have relatively little effect on true science and true new therapies, which is one of the claims that are made. Finally, it's important to note that a significant share of the new approvals in any one year add very little to existing therapeutic impacts. That is, that some recent evidence shows that somewhere close to between 35 and 40% of new products that came on the line in recent years really added very little to the therapies that were already on the market. In fact, it was either zero or a very small positive response. That's not to say that all the drugs are like that, but rather that there are numerous drugs that come on every year that are late entrants that do not represent new science, and therefore, at the end of the day, do not represent new cures. And so I think those two pieces are important context to bear in mind as one assesses the claims and against giving Medicare the power to negotiate these drug product prices.
Thank you, Richard. I think you've shown that this is really about greed, not about patience or innovation. Jason, let's open up the lines for folks who've been listening who might have some questions.
Sounds good, Leslie. If you have a question, you can do two things. You can either press the raise hand feature down at the bottom, and if you've dialed in, you can use the *9 button to show us that you have a question. So while we give folks a second to raise their hand for a question, we're going to go to our first question, which is going to be Alex Roth. Alex, you should be able to talk now. Just a reminder, you'll start on mute.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to do this. This one's actually, if Representative Welch is still on, I wanted to ask him very specifically, you know,
Yep.
if you know, when the framework comes out, if the negotiation is this narrow, would you oppose it? Would you not take the rest of what the thing is offering? The way they were sort of, it's been pitched as well, you know, doing something is going to be pretty crucial here. You know, or is there something else like the administration can do to back this up? So my questions were, you know, would you ultimately oppose a much narrower negotiation, or is this, you know, still part of just the discussion of back of?
No, we've got to succeed on the Build Back Better initiative, and I've been counseling my colleagues who have really strong positions on other elements not to make ultimatums, and I'm not going to make an ultimatum here. We're working entirely with Democrats, so we've got to try to persuade folks who have some of these reservations, and there's time to do that. And obviously, the president can play a major role here because there's really only a very few number of senators and a very few number of House members who are opposed to this. And we all know it's very popular. It's political malpractice, in my view, if we don't pass it. And in fact, interestingly enough, our frontline members are very, very in support of this. Jared Golden from Maine just wrote an op-ed in Medium saying that, well, he's got some hard choices to make on Build Back Better. This is not one of them. So I'm not going to make an ultimatum, but I am going to keep fighting until the last dog dies to get this included.
Okay, sounds good. I think we'll go to our next question. We're going to go to Alice Olstein. Alice, you should be able to talk. And again, just a reminder, you'll be on mute to start.
Thank you so much. For Congressman Welch, what is your understanding of how the talks on this have gone over the weekend? Because I think as of last week, you were feeling pretty good about where things stand. And now there seems to be a lot of concern that things are going in a direction that concerns you. So wanted to hear what your understanding of the latest is, and then also what to expect this week.
Well, there's three important issues. Okay, one is, do you include the concept of negotiation? Two, does that negotiation apply during the exclusivity period? And three, do you get inflation rebates? And the talks have proceeded well on inflation recapture, as I understand it. I'm not, you know, this would all be people who know more than I do about it. But my understanding is that on inflation rebates, there's progress being made. On the theoretical use of negotiation in the Peters bill, that's there, but it is in effect a fig leaf because it's not negotiation when it matters. And the problem we have is that with the original exclusivity period, that then gets extended in the ways that Dr. Frank mentioned, you know, in some cases up to 23 years, we are at the mercy of the monopoly pricing power. And the folks who've opposed HR 3 are taking the position that there can be no negotiation at all during that exclusivity period, no matter how long it gets extended. And that just breaks the back of any type of consumer protection. You know, I just want to give an example on that. You know, this drug Aduhelm, Dr. Frank, I hope pronounce it better, but that's the Alzheimer's drug that has very mixed reviews, even from the FDA. They don't know if it'll work or it won't. But there's 6 million folks on who have Alzheimer's that would be eligible for that drug in Medicare. And even though Wall Street thought it should be priced around $8,000, they priced it at $55,000 or so, and it has to be done in an inpatient setting. So it'd be about $60,000 per year. If 1/3 of the eligible Medicare beneficiaries used that drug, it would cost $110 billion, which exceeds the expenditures on all other medications and all other for all of the diseases for Medicare and folks in Medicare Part B. It's not sustainable.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to also just reiterate, I know we have one more question, I think, or two, that the point you made before, which is that the frontliners and the quote unquote moderates in the House are very much in support of negotiations. The people who are opposed to negotiations are not moderates. The people who are opposed to negotiations are people who basically are doing the handiwork of pharma and standing against patients. It's not a question of being a moderate or not a moderate. Jason, we have another question.
Yeah, next, excuse me. Next, we're gonna go to John Wilkerson. Give me 1 second, John. I have to promote you up to a panelist real quick. Looks like your Zoom is an older version, so I think you should be coming up right now.
Okay, great. Yeah, my first question is kind of technical, and then I guess a second question that's more general. But I hear people talk about exclusivity a lot, and then it sounds like you're talking about patents when you talk about drugs being on the market for like 25 years or 23 years without, competition. So am I understanding the Peters approach or the approach that's being considered correctly, that it would apply only to exclusivity? Because obviously exclusivity is long, it's 12 years, but once you're off exclusivity, it doesn't matter if you patent game. At that point, I would think if we're only talking about exclusivity, it would be up for negotiation. And the second point, the second question I wanted to ask, the more general one, is what would you consider to be a foot in the door? Legislation is often incremental. So if you could get kind of negotiation in Part D, it would seem like, there's no non-interference clause in Part B as in boy, but in Part D there is. So even if you have all these restrictions on which Part D drugs you can negotiate for, would it be a win to some extent just to get rid of that non-interference clause, and then you can tighten the screws from there in later years?
I want to try and take a shot at that one.
Go ahead, David.
The way the Peters bill is written, and we can send you the text, is that you get, a drug is not eligible for negotiation while it is in its period of FDA exclusivity, which, as you know, could be 5, 7, or 10 years, or 12 years, and during its period of being patent protected. But the bill says that you can file one additional patent within 1 year of FDA approval. A patent, as you know, John, runs for 20 years. So that means that's 21 years of patent protection. And the bill specifies that we may not negotiate over drugs that are either patent protected or in their FDA period of exclusivity. 21 years, John, for every drug, not just the small molecule drugs or the not just the long-term biologics with 12 years, but go to 21. Every drug could be protected by getting a patent within the first year after getting FDA exclusivity, meaning we'd have a whole parade of drugs from now until forever that we could not negotiate over for 21 years. That is worse than the situation we have right now, far worse. And this is pharma's smart jujitsu trying to say, well, we're for negotiation, but not on those drugs that are patent protected or in exclusivity. And oh, by the way, we're going to set it up so that we get 21 years that no one will be able to touch us on negotiation. That's why the Peter Schrader's bill is a fraud. And that's why it is really designed to help pharma and hurt patients. And by the way, on the Part B and D thing, I take a Part D drug, I take 2 Part B drugs, I take other drugs, but the main chemo drugs, these are all ridiculously expensive drugs. We have to get at all of them. Now, in order to help patients, It's about that. It's about the fact that we can't let them go on dictating prices to us of Part B or D drugs. We should be able to negotiate over all drugs that are incredibly costly and are hurting people by allowing the companies to continue to dictate prices.
David, that's very well said. Representative Welch, you have any closing remarks? If other than that, we'll close this call down because our listeners have been very patient with us. All right, this is great. I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank all those who listened. These next few days are critical. I think you've heard clearly that this latest proposal from the pro-farmer members of Congress is nothing but a step backwards. Representative Welch?
Well, no, thank you. I really appreciate all the folks being on this and following it. It's really crucial. And I think the point that David made is that the cure here is worse than the disease with the patent addition. So there you go. Pharma, once again, is trying to leverage this into not only avoiding fair pricing, but advancing price gouging.
Yeah. And if this is included in the package, there's no way that people can really call this negotiations. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.